doubly happy that we made you come. Our next speaker is Dr. Reut Harari. Reut is a lecturer at the East Asian Studies Department at Tel Aviv University. She joined the department after completing her PhD at the History of Science program in Princeton University. She is currently working on her first book, which is on the history of military medics in modern Japan. And the title of her talk, something I should have told you about also for the former speakers, is Disease, Military Medicine, and Public Health in the Absence of Empire, Thoughts from Meiji Japan. Reut.
Okay, hello everyone. As you've just heard, I work on Japan, which is a place with a rich history of environmental catastrophes, but I don't research them. So I'm going to talk about military medicine and disease during the Meiji era, which I do research. And I'll argue that the military played an important role as both the victim of disease and its producer, but that in the absence of empire, its role would have been much more limited, if not non-existent, while disease would have spread, been interpreted and treated in a different way. But before everything, I'll start with some historical background. So as you can see in my title, the driving force of my discussion is the rise of modern imperialism, which was central in Japan's modern history. It was a catalyst of many changes that affected almost every aspect of life in Japan, from politics and foreign affairs to the environment and the individual body. And the usual starting point of this history was the famous arrival of the American Commodore Matthew Perry and his black ominous ships, which you could see here. So he arrived with his ships in Edo in 1853. Edo was the political center of Japan at the time, and its contemporary Tokyo, but it was called Edo then. So the ships arrived after over 200 years of limited foreign affairs. The Tokugawa regime, the rulers of the time, only allowed China, Korea, and the Netherlands to conduct limited trade with Japan. This changed when the black ships arrived, bringing with them an ultimatum: open up your doors or we will shoot our cannons. And a year later, the Tokugawa regime decided to agree to the American demands. The regime heard that the Great China lost its first Opium War. They didn't know it was the first then, but they knew that it was vanquished not too long before the ships arrived. And it also calculated that after over 200 years of internal peace, Japan's military power wasn't as strong as the American. So the Tokugawa signed agreements termed the Unequal treaties. These treaties required Japan to give up significant parts of its sovereignty to America, and quickly after, to basically all the main Western powers of the time. And this was a major blow to Japan. There was a lot of anger in different parts of the country, resulting in a civil war just a few years later in 1868, and the war resulted in the fall of the Tokugawa regime and the establishment of the Meiji government by the leaders of the war. And as many of you might know, the Meiji government, upon its establishment, initiated numerous reforms. The Meiji leaders wanted to cancel the unequal treaties and prevent the possibility of even worse intervention in its internal affairs. Japan theoretically could have become a Western colony. So the Meiji leaders believed that the way to protect Japan was to learn the secrets of the West and turn Japan into a modern nation state and empire. Because if you're an empire yourself, you don't become someone else's colony. And this was a very deliberate process. The Meiji leaders sent people abroad to learn different fields and decide what to take from where, and they employed foreign advisors and teachers. They imported a great number of books, treatises, and tools, and based on this, they initiated their famous reforms. They created a parliament and wrote a constitution. They initiated compulsory education for boys and girls. They changed architecture, technology, science, agriculture, gender relations, etc., etc. For our presentation today, one reform was particularly important, and that was the establishment of a new military following the French and Prussian militaries, and as such, it was to be based on general conscription. And this was significant because in Tokugawa times, society was officially divided into 4 hierarchical classes or statuses: the samurai, followed by peasants, artisans, and merchants. What differentiated the highest class from the others was its monopoly over military action. The right to fight placed them on top. General conscription broke this monopoly. Any man from a certain age could serve if he were physically fit. So the focus moved to the physical body. And this is, of course, a later photo, but that's the idea. So this was important, this shift, because the health and fitness of the male individual received new meaning. And consequently, you see that the new military included a medical department from the very beginning. So according to the memoir of a famous doctor called Matsumoto Jun, in 1870, he received a visit from Yamagata Aritomo. Yamagata built the new conscripted military only 3 years later. And during this visit, Yamagata asked Matsumoto to establish the medical department in the military, saying, "We finally have a military ministry, but we lack the most necessary department of all, the medical department." And that is interesting, because this means that the military ascribed a lot of importance to the care of its soldiers from the very beginning, at least officially. And what we see is that from the 1870s, the Meiji military created an elaborate medical system to treat the soldiers it conscripted. And it's also interesting because this wasn't the rule in the world at the time. There was an ongoing global conversation as both military and medicine underwent significant changes worldwide. Every country looked at the other. Every war became a stage to view how new structures and techniques worked in practice. New codes of conduct in war were being phrased. The Geneva Convention, which provided immunity to medical structures in wartime, was signed only in 1864. So this was really just a few years before. And evidence shows that militaries took a long time to implement these new ideas within their lines. They weren't the norm. And into this conversation, Japan entered. And the medicine that the Japanese military men were to practice were not supposed to be local forms of what we call Sino-Japanese medicine either, though in practice many did actually continue to use local medicine. But officially, the military as an institution was supposed to have been an important leader of medical reform in Japan. Medical reform was aimed to replace local medicines by what was referred to as Western medicine, which in Japan largely meant German medicine. And the military was important because it had an advantage as an implementer of reform. Its soldiers were a captive audience. They didn't have the choices that they would have had in the medical marketplace. They got what the military gave them, and so they encountered new forms of treatment. The military was also a training center for different medical personnel. It created new medical roles for common soldiers, teaching them topics like anatomy and physiology. The military also built new kinds of medical institutions called hospitals, since it took out the conscripted men from their homes, and the home was the main space of care till then. So you could say that the military produced medical knowledge, caregivers, medical institutions, and it produced patients. And the military also produced disease, not just tried to produce the cures for it. And this is an interesting point because by the time we reached the Russo-Japanese War, the Japanese military became known worldwide for its success in vanquishing the silent foe, i.e., vanquishing disease in wartime, which is an image that exists till this day. And what do I mean by that? So meticulous planning went into the new Meiji military, and this planning was very quickly put to the test. There were 3 major wars during this era: the Satsuma Civil War already in 1877, followed by 2 major international wars, the Sino-Japanese and Russo-Japanese wars. And these wars concluded in the abolishment of the Unequal treaties, the establishment of Japan's first colonies, and the global recognition of Japan as an empire. So it was a success for Japan. The wars were also very important as sites for knowledge production. In a period of flux, each war was a laboratory and every war an experiment. And so after each war, military doctors wrote reports discussing the lessons that they learned and suggesting improvements for the future. And these reports reveal what the military's priorities were and where planning went wrong. And from the reports you see, I argue that the military built its medical system around wounds. It saw the battlefield as a space where the human body was harmed by weapons. So surgery was very important, and that fit the agenda of medical reformers because they believed surgery and anatomy set Western medicine apart from Sino-Japanese medicine. This doesn't mean the military ignored disease, but it saw it as something to prevent and something to be treated behind the lines, not on the battlefield. But as you can imagine, the wars drew a very different picture. Each war was full of disease, which the military spread and even produced. During and after the Satsuma Civil War, which took place within Japan, there were outbreaks of what was referred to as cholera around the country, all over Japan. And it was believed that the military carried it, as well as other diseases like syphilis, and that the military spread them among the population. And cholera among them was a particularly terrifying epidemic because it spread and killed thousands of people very quickly. And you see that during the war and after the war, there were outbreaks of it. And because of the fear of cholera, or what was termed cholera, the Meiji government initiated public health policies, mainly in the cities. So mostly inspired by Germany and the rising concept of hygiene, the Meiji government established quarantine hospitals, worked to educate the public on the role of the individual in preserving the health of the collective. There were vaccination campaigns for other diseases, etc. So there was a lot of intervention from above because the population had to be strong to withstand external threats in this new global environment. And the military did try and implement different measures to prevent disease, but it still continued to ravish the soldiers, and we see also an outbreak following the Sino-Japanese War of cholera yet again. But when we reached the Russo-Japanese War, more soldiers died of wounds than disease, and that was why the Japanese military was celebrated all over the world for its disease prevention ability. This was and is considered one of the first cases in history of this happening. Throughout history, soldiers died mostly of disease. But what I argue is that if you look at the actual statistics, you see that fewer soldiers died of disease, but there were many sick soldiers, far more than wounded soldiers. They survived, but they flooded the military medical system that couldn't prevent the spread of disease. And testimonies describe how military medical personnel were unable to cope with the need around them. And why was this the case? So there are various possible reasons, but one has to do again with the military's ironic role in producing disease at the same time that it worked to prevent it. So when we look at military medical statistics, of course, historical statistics are problematic, but they give an idea. So these statistics and reports show that soldiers were sick with all sorts of diseases. Fighting abroad, they encountered different conditions and pathogens. A shortage of clean water and food resulted in diseases of the digestive system, which were the highest occurring diseases in the war. But the second highest recurring disease was beriberi, which the military believed was an infectious disease. And that is very interesting because today we interpret beriberi as a disease caused by vitamin B1 or thiamine deficiency. And when your diet is based only on polished white rice, you get sick because thiamine exists in rice bran or in barley. But it was a modern epidemic in Japan. We would imagine that it would have been an epidemic throughout history, but actually, beriberi existed in very small numbers in Japan before the modern era, because unlike its image, most of the Japanese population couldn't afford white rice. They dreamt of it, but they ate mostly barley and brown rice at best, so the disease was mostly prevalent among the nobility who could afford white rice. So why was it so common in the military? Because in order to build Japan as a modern nation state, its leaders searched for symbols, and they believed that a nation state required a national dish, a type of food that would epitomize its identity. And there were different suggestions, but the strongest camp was for white rice. And among the white rice camp were leading military doctors who built the military medical system, and they also created the military diet, as Alex Bay shows in his book that I just showed you. And the military diet was therefore based on polished white rice. And according to Bay, although the Navy argued that beriberi was caused by nutrition, the Army doctors refused to change the soldiers' diet and insisted beriberi was an infectious disease. And since the soldiers were again a captive audience, they ate what they were provided. And so tens of thousands of men developed the disease during both the Sino-Japanese and the Russo-Japanese wars. It was an epidemic that the military created. So although the military made a lot of effort to learn from experience, imperial symbolism was stronger, resulting in what Proctor termed agnotology, or willful ignorance. So before we start speculating, to shortly sum up my points, what we can take from all of this was that the rise of modern imperialism started a chain of events that led to the establishment of a new medical health regime based on and promoted by the military. The trauma of the black ships and the fear of wider imperial takeover resulted in a concentrated effort to build new structures to protect Japan from external threats and built it as an empire of its own. The way in which this was to be done was unclear, so this was a history of deliberation, which created new forms of care for the individual's body. But it also placed the individual in harm's way in new ways, including in the path of disease. What would have happened if the Meiji Restoration wouldn't have happened, and if Western imperialism would have skipped over Japan? So 10 years ago, there was a popular Japanese drama called Jin, which means humanity in Japanese, and it's also the name of the main character of the drama. And there's a Korean version of this also, but I only watched the Japanese, of course. So in this drama, Jin is a neurosurgeon who suddenly and strangely goes back in time to 1862, after the black ships arrived, but just before the Meiji Restoration and its reforms. And what happens in the drama, besides a moving love story, is that Jin brings back with him his modern biomedical skills into the past. So in 1862, another cholera epidemic broke out in Edo. And in the drama, they show how numerous people contracted very quickly, and Jin helps to treat them by hydrating them, but he also at a certain point begins to develop penicillin and miraculously cures many, many people. Oop. So what this drama does is tell a very triumphalist story, a homage to biomedicine and indirectly to the Meiji reforms that paved the way for it. Because, for example, after he goes back to the present, Jin's disciples continue to produce penicillin in the past, but it disappears. It doesn't become a national-scale cure as it does in the 1950s when the government and industry mass produce it. So the context is stronger than the individual in this drama. But on the other hand, the series makes an interesting point about Tokugawa medicine and the circulation of knowledge. So Jin meets all these important historical figures that I read about, including leading Tokugawa doctors. And the drama shows how some of them saw Jin and his new ways as a threat, but others embraced the knowledge that he brought and worked to learn and combine it in their own work. And they chose to do it without the central government intervening. They did it because they were interested, and also because it gave them a commercial edge in a competitive medical marketplace. And that actually is a good representation of how medical knowledge worked in Tokugawa Japan before the Meiji Restoration. There were numerous schools of medicine based on different theories and practices. Many of them originated in China, and there wasn't Chinese medicine. There were different types of schools of medicine which arrived to Japan and underwent different developments within Japan. Japanese doctors analyzed, experimented, and developed methods of their own. There was also a famous strand of Dutch medicine. The Dutch East India Company received exclusive access to Japan. It had a tiny trading post near Nagasaki, and one of the things it brought with it was knowledge of science, technology, and the most important field was medicine because it had the most demand within Japan. Scholars in Japan, led by doctors and interpreters who worked in Nagasaki, studied Dutch and translated books, first of all in the field of medicine. Some came even to Nagasaki to learn directly from Dutch surgeons who served there or from the interpreters who worked with them. And these students established schools and techniques of their own. And while doctors often tried to keep their techniques a secret, it was very common for students to come from the countryside to one of the major cities, learn different kinds of medicine with different schools, and then return to their villages. They would also correspond with doctors in other places around the country and exchange ideas. So knowledge moved and developed, and you find a lot of cross-pollination. And one of the most interesting and famous examples of cross-pollination was a doctor called Hanaoka Seishu, who was the first doctor in the world to conduct surgery under general anesthesia, because he saw Dutch books on surgery and he couldn't understand how you could do that to a person without dealing with the pain the procedure involved. So based on knowledge he learned from the Dutch, from Chinese sources, his own experiments, he developed a formula that allowed him to operate under general anesthesia in 1804, a few decades before this happened in the West. So I think that if the Meiji Restoration wouldn't have happened, this eclecticism would have continued, creating a very different type of medicine. And without the government leading reforms from above, Dutch medicine would have remained only one strand within many. And we should remember that at this time in history, Western medicine arguably had little to offer. We're on the cusp of the so-called biomedical revolution, and as we just heard from Liat, germ theory, even in the 1870s, isn't mainstream, and you don't have yet all the solutions that we know today. And Japanese doctors weren't really interested in humors and bloodletting. They were interested in anatomy and surgery, which weren't common in Japan. But as you know, medicine continued changing throughout this time beyond Japan, and the knowledge of these changes, I believe, would have still continued to enter because there was a demand for it. It wouldn't have entered in an organized, deliberated form as it did in the Meiji era, where everything went through a careful selection process. The doctors would translate works that arrived via the Dutch. They didn't choose, they didn't control what information they had access to. But they still were exposed to different forms of knowledge, so I believe the dominant driving force would have continued from below. I also think that even without Commodore Matthew Perry, the Tokugawa would have changed its foreign policy, gradually allowing more interaction with other countries, because before Perry's black ships, both Russia and Britain tried to open up Japan, and they were rebuffed. But there were more and more voices within Japan calling for a change. And the Tokugawa shogunate even opened its own translation bureau to learn more about the world. So I believe that it's possible that the Tokugawa would have gradually changed the way it interacted with the world on its own terms and opened more opportunity for knowledge circulation, developing different forms of medicine, which would have possibly also circulated from Japan abroad. Not just in. There was a lot of interest in Europe in things that came from Japan at the time. There wouldn't have been a conscripted military. I sincerely doubt it. First of all, that wasn't the norm in the world at the time. The Meiji leaders chose France and Germany as models, but they were the outliers. And more importantly, Tokugawa society, as we just said, was built on social hierarchy, where the samurai were the ruling class, and only a massive shock to the system, a trauma like the black ships, would have induced these people to give up their privileges. So the military would have continued to consist, I believe, of local militias and central forces, and it wouldn't have engaged in international warfare because there was no need to become a Western-styled empire. So in terms of epidemics, you wouldn't have a marching military spreading cholera. But I think cholera would still have spread because of a few things. So, first of all, the first cholera outbreak was already in 1822. So it arrived through trade, and as historians like William Johnston argued, it became endemic in Japan. That is what historians believe. So it was already there, and it spread in 1858, killing over 100,000 people, and also in between the wars that we talked about, without sick soldiers moving around. And also, Tokugawa agriculture was based on night soil, on the use of human excrement as fertilizer, which today we believe is the main cause of cholera. And also, you had people moving around a lot during the Tokugawa period. So the central Tokugawa government was in Edo, but Japan was divided into local domains, and the lords of the domains had to divide their time between the domains in Edo. So they would periodically travel with their entourage to and from Edo. Many people also went on pilgrimages. There was medical tourism. Many new roads were built as a result. And the massive outbreak of cholera in 1858 followed these existing roads. And finally, there was massive urbanization at the time. It's estimated that by 1850, there were over 1 million people living in Edo alone. And Kyoto and Osaka were also substantial cities, and there were others. So these centers were hotbeds for disease, you could argue. And indeed, the 1858 cholera outbreak hit Edo the hardest. So if cholera was endemic and there were population centers and there was widespread use of night soil as fertilizer, cholera might have spread irrespective. The difference would have been in the way the government dealt with it. The Meiji government actively interfered to protect the nation's power. The Tokugawa regime did very little. The individual's body wasn't as important to the nation since there was no nation. They could have wanted to intervene to maintain order because epidemics caused social upheaval, as we know. But even so, the regime was quite weak, so I doubt it would have had the power to implement drastic measures. Instead, you could see local measures and initiatives by doctors. So the local governments were stronger, and doctors worked to research and counter this mysterious disease. So throughout the 19th century, Japanese doctors searched in both Chinese and Dutch sources for information suggesting different types of cures. And many of them focused on nutrition, explaining what to eat, what to avoid. And by the way, these recommendations continued in the Meiji era, in addition to government policies. But the most interesting thing is that, according to Johnston, there was a local interpretation of cholera in Japan as being a waterborne epidemic. And by the end of the 19th century, people called on their local governments to intervene in the supply of pure water. So you had bacteriological explanation coming in, but they reinforced something that already existed in Japan. So I would suggest then that efforts, works, and research would have continued, and that things would have gotten worse. If things would have gotten worse, the local governments would have intervened and done something more substantial, irrespective of external influence. And finally, without empire, beriberi would possibly still have been an epidemic, but in a different way for different reasons. So without the Meiji reforms, there wouldn't have been this drive to define polished rice as the national dish. There wouldn't have been conscripted soldiers eating only white rice in wartime and falling ill in the thousands. But according to Bei, during the late Tokugawa period, people who lived in Edo ate more white rice. It was more accessible for different reasons, and people loved it. And this is when sushi began, actually. So there were suddenly more cases of beriberi in Edo as a result of this, which is why doctors thought it was caused by environmental factors, that it was an urban disease, not a military disease. But I think it would have been contained much faster without modernity, because there were Japanese doctors who recommended eating barley as a cure, not because of vitamins, obviously. That wasn't the explanation. They gave different explanations for it, but they saw that this cure worked. And this would have happened in an easier way without empire, because Meiji military doctors rejected this cure because it smelled to them too much of Sino-Japanese medicine, which wasn't Western and modern enough. It harmed their efforts to promote medical modernization. And this wouldn't have been an issue in the absence of empire. There might have been also other epidemics. Smallpox and measles did spread, causing much damage. So I don't know. Medicine would have definitely been different. Epidemiology would have been different. The environment would have been different. But also many things maybe would still have occurred. The circulation of knowledge and reform, possibly the demise of the Tokugawa regime, but in a different pace, scale, led by different people and for different purposes. Maybe. Thank you.